Welcome to the Coming Clean podcast with your host, Peter O. Estevez.
Hit a dash in my position, you will never last. Real talk, I had to get it from the mall. Real talk, now I'm vibing with a bankroll. Cash.
Hello, and welcome to the new episode of Coming Clean podcast. This is your host, Peter O. Estevez. I want to remind you before we get started to please go and sign up on my website, Coming Clean Podcast, and subscribe and apply to be one of the first people to receive the first chapter of my upcoming book, From Lies to Riches, to be released in the next 90 days. So please do that, sign up. But let's get started and let's go on with the show. Today, I have an incredible lady, and not layer in the space of in the cannabis private equity space, Codie Sanchez. Codie, how are you? And thank you for sharing your time with us today.
I'm thrilled to be here. Thanks for having me. I even feel like we're matching a little bit today. We got our black on. We've got our glasses ready to go.
We are. I think I think there's that energy in the air that connected us.
Exactly.
Codie, I had followed you on social media for a while, and I have a lot of respect and admiration for what you do. And you're definitely one of the first women out there that has been in the forefront of private equity lending in the cannabis space. But, your background is in journalism. You come from a very conservative background. You actually, as a journalist, you reported the drug trafficking between Mexico and the U.S. along the U.S. border. So you with all of that in mind, how did you end up in this space, and why the cannabis space?
Yeah. So, the interesting part is when I was a journalist, I kind of quickly realized that the best way to make an impact wasn't just telling people's stories. It was having the capital to be able to actually rewrite people's stories. And so that's when I started to believe that financial freedom is really the underpinning of all freedom. And so once I started to understand that, I realized I didn't know very much about money, and so I was like, what? Because, Peter, when I was writing these stories, my last name's Sanchez, right? Like you said. And I was writing about lots of other people whose last name was Sanchez, but the difference between me and them, yes, there was a border in between. So at first I could say maybe it's that there's more opportunities as an American, but also the opportunity was really that I just came from a different socioeconomic background. I didn't come from massive wealth, but I at least came from middle-class wealth in the US, which is the difference between these people who had no power and whatever power I had in my career. And so, once I realized that, I wanted to figure out more about money. I wanted to understand it as a tool. We were talking before this about how money is just a vehicle. It doesn't really interest me to have more money just for myself to buy bigger and better things. You reach a certain wealth level and you kind of are like, hey, more money's great because then I can make a bigger impact, but I don't need more watches or cars or big houses, right? In fact, maybe I'd have a few more houses, but I want all of them to be smaller. Like I don't want more to take care of, right? And so I, climbed through my career through a bunch of different financial firms, from Goldman to State Street to Vanguard to First Trust, and sort of built up my career focusing on bringing Latinos and women into these different groups and giving back to the Latin American market because I saw firsthand what was going on there. And it wasn't like the divisive identity politics that we see today. It was just, here's a group that could use some help. Let's help them, And so I did that for a long time and did well in Latin America, built a big business there, then sold out of that business and was looking for the next emerging market. And I wanted the next emerging market that also had this arbitrage opportunity where it wasn't super crowded yet, because when I got into Latin America, that was the case in the investments I was doing. And lo and behold, I found cannabis purely from nonprofit work I was doing with veterans with PTSD. So it was a long and windy road all the way to here.
When I think about cannabis, okay, I think of a few things come to mind. The war on drugs from the Reagan administration. Ronald Reagan, Nancy Reagan, the hippie areas of the 60s, although, I'm not from that generation, but I remember that as a child. I remember the taboos and the fears that my parents instill in me through their beliefs okay, which, by the way, I don't necessarily hold much value to those beliefs anymore, to certain of them, because I believe like some of those beliefs had limited me and many of my generation from advancing and serving better to the world, okay? But I remember all those fears, and as a matter of fact, I can tell you that I have smoked marijuana once or twice. I am one of those individuals that and I didn't inhale, by the way. And I am one of those individuals that I had an issue with alcohol, and I'm very open about that. I've been sober 20 years, but I had a battle with alcohol for a long time. Now, coming from a Hispanic background and from a traditional background, as you and I spoke earlier, why the cannabis space, and what is it about the cannabis space that today we don't know, we don't have the correct information? Because like money, like finances, like resources, there's a lot of illiteracy in our culture about what the space is.
Yeah, it's such a good question. So a couple fold. One, I always think that if something is to be sustainable, it has to be profitable. So, the first thing I looked at from a financial perspective was, is there an opportunity for wealth creation in cannabis? And I needed that as just foundational. Everything that I do needs to have some ability to be profitable enough to sustain itself and to be worth the time and investment in it, because I take that money and I do lots of other things with it. So there's an opportunity cost if that's not there. So that was necessary. And when I looked at the market, I realized, wow, there's a huge opportunity for generational wealth creation, because there is a $50 billion US market in cannabis right now. And that's legal and illegal. The legal market, when I first got into this space, was about $8 billion. Today, it's $20 billion. So over the course of less than 4 years, we've seen the market more than double. We've seen the market almost triple. And that's just going to continue, in my opinion. So I was like, okay, there is a generational wealth creation event here. And there is one also because there's this, to your point, stigma and stereotypes surrounding the plant that goes all the way from reefer madness to, today, are you just going to be lazy and be in your basement, smoking marijuana all day, right? So that's the stigma. And so I knew that stigma was going to keep out a lot of the institutional money. And if the institutional money isn't in there, then the little guys, people like me, we run a couple $100 million fund, but that's small in private equity. My last fund was billions, right? But it's huge in cannabis because there's not access to liquidity. So every dollar I invest has an unfair advantage from my standpoint because the market isn't crowded. So that was one, like, is there money here? Is there profit? Yes. Then number two was equally as important to me, which is does it make an impact in a way that I want to make an impact on the world? And is it something good? Because you know this as well, but after you've made money in a few ventures, you kind of are like, well, there's a lot of ways to make money. It's never that I run out of ideas for making money. I just don't have the time or executional capability to execute on all of them. So the next thing I was like, well, do I want my name associated with this? And do I believe in it? And how I got on board with that is I did a lot of research. I'm a journalist, so that's kind of natural. But I was working with a group of veterans, wounded veterans who were coming back from Afghanistan and Iraq, missing arms and legs, actually in Dallas, here in Houston, but in Dallas, Texas at the time. And they were given these opioid cocktails, right? When they, were diagnosed with PTSD or severe chronic lifelong pain. And the problem is that these cocktails were killing them. These guys were committing suicide. They were getting divorced. They weren't able to keep down jobs. They were very unhealthy. They were drinking a ton. And what we found out is that if instead of using opioid cocktails, these guys were self-medicating with illegal cannabis at the time, but that was able to get them off the opioids and their lives sort of stabilized. The hyper-awareness and hypersensitivity and anxiety and lack of ability to sleep was lessened by cannabis. It's not a panacea, but opioids are great for short-term intense pain. They're not good for chronic long-term pain. And so that's when I was like, wow, there's really something here that is of benefit to the world. And I think we can make a lot of money and make a lot of impact doing it.
Great. And to your point, I am part of a group which my partners lead, or one of my partners leads, the Red Bird out of Oklahoma. And we are in a partnership, or they are in a partnership with MD Anderson. There's a lot of research being done for medical benefit in that space. But why is it that with all the benefits that we have from the cannabis space, why is it that we are not reporting enough? You as a journalist, as a former journalist, why do you believe that there's not enough information out there in the world for people to understand that? Because I can tell you that there's something would happen with information and with cultures and generations getting wealth and getting advanced, okay? Today, in particular in the Hispanic culture, which I've done a lot of research on because it's something I'm very passionate about, there's a tremendous gap between generations, okay? You have the parents that there's a lot of illiteracy, financial, even in beliefs, okay? And then we have the young, brilliant minds, the young millennials in other generations that are full of wisdom, not full of information, but lacking wisdom and lacking experience, okay? So there's almost a separation of the cultures to where you can't bring them together for them to be able to meet and understand and together as a unit move forward and bring those changes. How do we bring that information to where that becomes a dialogue, a conversation between the parents and the children, and they're able to meet and now make informed decisions instead of being shut down, okay, by limited beliefs? How do we do that?
Yeah, it's such a good point. Well, I mean, I think the beautiful thing is like, there was a quote that I heard that said that history makes bigots of us all. And I kind of love that because I think the thing is we can try to speed things up, but in reality, the future does it for us. That over time, I sort of believe that the truth comes out. And so I think we're seeing that right now with cannabis, but we're seeing that, it's very hard. We as humans are funny. We can self-rationalize incredibly, all of us, for everything that we do. And so we can choose to select only the information or news sources that we believe in and say that no other data exists. But then what happens is we start to meet people that don't fit all of the self-selecting beliefs that we've told ourselves. And so one of the biggest things we can do is, and one of the reasons I'm very public, is I probably don't look anything like someone who would stereotypically be in cannabis. I went to Georgetown. Like you said, I'm Hispanic. I come from a conservative background. I was born in Arizona. I lend towards conservative beliefs, both politically and otherwise. I really don't look anything like someone traditional in cannabis. And I was not a cannabis user. I've become one now in some more wellness focused ways, less recreational. But I don't look anything like that. And I think when people see more and more individuals getting into the industry, talking about it, and talking about their use cases for cannabis, it's hard to then associate only this stoner stereotype. And so we try to bring out those stories of my grandmother, who's 93, who has rheumatoid arthritis and uses cannabis, or the fact that she just had back surgery and they gave her a bunch of opioids, which made her very nauseous and she really wasn't doing well on them. And I gave her cannabis, and like my sweet little grandma has a little tea with a honey stick in it that she stirs in. And, the first time she calls me and she's like, Codie, I feel a little funny, but she's like, but my back pain's gone, right? And she's able to sleep for the first time in weeks after the surgery. So those stories start to add up. And then I think it's hard to have that narrative be first and foremost. So I think all we can do is keep sharing, keep bringing more people into the loop, and keep bringing up, new research and ideas in as many platforms as we can that counter the historical stigma.
Codie, typically when something becomes democratized, as cannabis is becoming, typically gives us an opportunity, gives the small business person, the medium-sized business people, to partake in it, okay, to become part of, to create that generational wealth that you're talking about. But now what we're beginning to see in the cannabis space is that pharma is getting into it. The tobacco industry is getting into it. Constellation Brands, one of the biggest brands in the world that has acquired everything, okay, from Corona beer to every other major brand in the world, is entering the space. What impact does that do to the industry?
Yeah, it's so fascinating. Well, so I think there was a huge rush by these players early in the cannabis. Well, not early, but in 2017 through 2019, we saw a lot of billion-dollar deals happen in cannabis, and we profited from some of those, which was great, including Constellation Brands buying up Canopy Growth, which we had shares in, and Acreage, which we had shares in. But what's fascinating, actually, is how few players have still gotten into cannabis. So I would say there's been 7 or 8 really big deals in cannabis that have happened thus far. But they're still small by comparison into any other industry. And what's fascinating is, like, this last week, I don't know if you saw it, but Pabst Blue Ribbon, remember that, like, hipster kind of beer?
Sure.
And it used to be the working man's beer, and then it became the hipster beer. But so
very
Pabst
popular in Texas. Very popular in Texas.
Oh yeah, you're right. You're right. So that they were the first company, mainstream alcohol company, that came out with a cannabis sparkling tonic this last week with their logo on it. So it's not a separate entity. It's not a separate brand. It is a Pabst, cannabis seltzer, and it's selling in 20 dispensaries in California. And so I think there's going to be more of that happening. And what's going to happen quickly, it's already happening, is we are getting to the first consolidation phase in cannabis. And so we had this massive proliferation of brands in cannabis. There are hundreds and thousands of cannabis brands across all different types. And then we saw some consolidation as some of the bigger players gobbled up others, largely not external players like you were talking about. But the next phase is going to be these companies that are in cannabis exclusively. They need to scale. They need to get to $50 to $100 million in revenue, because if they don't, they won't be acquisition targets for the big players. And the big players will just come in as legalization lessens or increases and allows for more access. And they'll build their own companies because they can do it cheaper. So that is, the industry will, to your point, it will eventually be entered by all of the other players across. We always joke that if you go to a supermarket, hemp and cannabis could be in every aisle. It could be the packaging, it could be beverages, it could be food, it could be used for, desks and fabrics and clothes and rugs. And then cannabis could be used medicinally, it could be used recreationally. So if you think about it that way, that means that every industry is going to have its hand in hemp and cannabis in some way. And that's just inevitable. We have to build up the industry big enough for it to have some sort of culture itself before all of these big players come in. But that will happen.
Codie, we know historically that pharma and the tobacco industry are profit-driven. Profit-driven to the point of not caring for the well-being. What started as something benevolent, what started something as painkillers, for example, that was something that was to remedy the pain. It became something that, and we know this through lawsuits, we know this through government regulation, we know this through the opiate epidemic. At some point, it was more about profits than the well-being of the individual, the consumer. Okay, same thing with the tobacco industry. We know that throughout the United States, there were major lawsuits governments, attorney general's offices took against the tobacco industry to penalize them for the harm that was causing. How do we know, or what is it in cannabis, in the cannabis makeup that will not cause this to happen like it has happened with pharma and the tobacco industry?
Yeah, it's such an important question. So first, I would say this: as you mentioned, the tobacco executives are fueled by profits, right? So one of the things that's interesting is we've had conversations with many in tobacco and many in the pharmaceutical industry, both executives that are thinking about acquiring companies, as well as investors and private equity firms that specialize in those spaces. And I think there's something a little bit beautiful about this cannabis plant in that it is so much more profitable than the tobacco industry is, and the margins on the commodity are so much higher, at least right now, that I actually see tobacco eventually getting into this space in a bigger way. And I don't necessarily see that as a terrible thing, because if they're focused on profits from things besides tobacco only, and we have cannabis and hemp derived, chew or tobacco products, then that just means that there's less money pushing tobacco in general, right? And so there might actually be some natural attrition away from sort of these negative products that they have and moving towards products like hemp and cannabis that are more beneficial. The part that's interesting about the cannabis plant is that it doesn't have this nicotine addictive aspect of it like tobacco does. And so there needs to be more research. I'm not saying that cannabis is 100% not addictive, because I think we humans can get addicted to just about anything.
Anything. Shopping.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Working out. Yeah.
Exactly. Both positive or negative. So I'm sure there are some aspects of the plant, but what it doesn't have, at least as far as we can tell, is a neurological stimulant or need for the cannabis continuously as part of an addiction cycle or loop.
Craving.
Right. And so, so if that's the case, then, that's interesting in and of itself. The other thing about cannabis is that it doesn't have the, from a pesticides and growth perspective, the cannabis plant is a lot, they call it weed for a reason, right? It grows very intensely, very easily, and the systems and mechanisms used to grow it are much cleaner than the tobacco industry. It doesn't necessitate a massive amount of pesticides on top of it. And in fact, the whole industry really moves towards organic as opposed to these sort of pesticide-derived products. And then, the third aspect of it is we need more research, which I always stress. I'm not a doctor, but all the research that we've seen thus far seems to point to the fact that cannabis is helpful with things like cancer, both in prevention and certain types of cancer. There have been early studies in mice that show that utilizing cannabis, smoking cannabis, actually helps lung cancer. How bizarre is that?
Wow.
And so, the aspects of the plant itself are medicinally very beneficial for a lot of different instances. And, the interesting thing about cannabis is there's, some 60 odd cannabinoids inside of a cannabis plant. These are all just different things that interact with one another in order to give you different types of effects. So CBD has anti-inflammation effects. It's actually, you can prove that CBD does help with inflammation. And, THC seems to help with nausea. And so these aspects of it are just missing from the tobacco plant, which doesn't have any medicinal benefits by and large.
And I get that point, but what happens when you take something, I shared with you earlier that I had an ayahuasca experience, although I don't drink or use any or consume any other type of drugs, and alcohol for that matter. But I did the experience for a deeper connection with myself, for wellness, for wellness purposes, to try to tap into an area of myself that perhaps I have not been able to reach in the past. And that's my own personal beliefs. I know that some people hearing this may think I'm crazy by sharing what I'm sharing, but that's just my own personal beliefs. But what happens when the growing process, okay, when you commercialize it in the cannabis, and completely changes. I know that firsthand from Redbird in Oklahoma. So we go into indoor growing. There's the human element where we begin to alter and create our different connoisseur type of plants. Okay.
Yeah.
So what happens, or how is it? Is there regulation that prevents people from? Is there regulation today that we know of that prevents the industry from using pesticides, from chemically enhancing the product, from?
Yeah.
You get where I'm going with this?
Yeah. It's a great point. And the interesting thing about having an industry that's illegal is that there can't be regulatory oversight at this point.
Right.
So the industry is entirely self-policed for the most part. You can't put organic on anything yet, because anything that is even, you could say something's organic. You can't say it's certified organic. You can get into a lot of issues in the cannabis industry because there's not a regulatory body that overlooks it yet. So to your point, you have to be very careful if you're investing in the space or if you're consuming, that you're asking for things like, is this lab tested? And in the lab testing, do you check for any pesticides and additives? And is it, clean grown product? Is it sun grown? Is it indoor? Do you add additives to it during the extraction process, if you're using like a vape pen or an edible. So there is a lot of education that needs to be done on the space. And to your point, until it's fully legalized, we won't have the mandatory oversight and governance that the industry needs. So at this point, the things that you can really check for in the industry overall and that are supervised are, is it created in a legal facility? Because then it has to follow state laws, and those state laws are pretty onerous on them. And you need to make sure that you buy things in an actual legal dispensary or delivery group, because where you get into trouble with the additives like you're talking about or pesticides is when you buy illegally. And what this doesn't mean, some people think like, well, I'm never going to go buy illegally in a street corner. But what they don't realize is that kids might be doing that, right? And kids might be trading product back and forth. Or, if you just drive by a dispensary and just stop at any one, you might not realize that that's not actually a legal dispensary. There are some of those in California still left. They're getting cracked down on, but not all of them are legal. And so you really have to use a service like, Weed Maps now has cleaned up and gotten rid of any illegal operations on their site, and so has Ease. And the really big stores in any area like MedMen, Urban Leaf, NorCal, Harborside, those are all legal dispensaries where you're not going to have to worry about the origination of the product. But small stores, you might.
So now let's go talk about your business, the industry that you're in, okay? As a venture capitalist, what is the space that your company is interested in? What category of the business are you guys interested in? And who's the prime candidate for that?
Yeah. So when we invest in cannabis in our fund, we're looking for growth equity companies. So those are companies that do $10 to $20 million or more in revenue. So later stage companies in cannabis. And these are companies by and large that have some sort of moat around their business. So we probably wouldn't invest in just a pure cultivation play where they're going and growing the product. We're going to invest in something that is vertically integrated, where there's some licensing around it, where they actually have ability and control on the margin because they have more aspects of the supply chain down. We're also interested in brands because I think brands continuously in the future, that's where you're able to keep your margin, is by having a brand people will pay for. We're super interested also in ancillary businesses. Like we have a couple deals we're looking at that are tech-enabled plays to help the cannabis industry. But for the most part, we kind of look at two types of companies. One is a platform company. So that means a company that's doing, like I said, anywhere from 10 to let's say, $75 million in revenue, strong operational team, ability to execute, proven track record. Ideally, this isn't their first startup or their first business. They've had success in another industry. And they've translated that to cannabis, and they are willing and able to look at non-organic growth. So to do acquisitions, because right now is an incredible time to buy businesses in this market because there was a huge valuation reset. And those platform companies will be the ones that we do add-ons to. So then we'll go out into the space, and we've done this, 7 or 8 times now, where we'll find companies that are a little distressed, or companies that don't have enough capital to keep growing. And we invest in those companies and build them into some of our other companies in order to create companies that scale. And so, we get to go out there and save some cool companies that maybe weren't operated incredibly efficiently. And we get to give, sort of rocket fuel to the companies that are growing and doing the right thing in our platform companies.
What is the biggest misconception of a new startup in the cannabis space?
Yeah. I think probably the biggest misconception is people don't understand how much money it takes to build a cannabis company. I mean, this if you've invested in them. This is the opposite of a lean startup in cannabis. That, you have to have licenses cost hundreds of thousands of dollars to pre-qualify for and have all the paperwork for. You need to have hundreds of thousands of dollars in cash in order to actually run the business once it's live. They cost hundreds of thousands of dollars and millions of dollars in inventory you have to have. And then you're going to have product that doesn't meet your your parameters in some way. You're going to have, testing issues. You're going to have cultivation issues. It's a relatively complex business. So I think the average entrepreneur that gets into it thinks, weed, everybody likes it. How to go into this industry? And in reality, that's not really typically the case. It is much harder than one would think to succeed in this industry. And maybe that's why there's outsized return potential.
Yeah, and the reality is that, as I spend time in California, I walk around, I smell it everywhere. I see it everywhere. I see the dispensaries. To me, what I can compare it to is what cigarettes was in the 80s and 90s. Where people used to hang outside in their patios or their workspaces, during their breaks and smoke cigarettes. I mean, I see it's become so commonly used that is being ingrained into our culture. One of my favorite quotes from you, Codie, is most businesses don't fail, founders give up.
Yeah, I think that's very true. I mean, it is actually one of the reasons why the biggest underwrite we do is on founders, because at the end of the day, you can have the world's best idea, but you're going to have to pivot in some way, shape, or form. And the only thing I know for sure is that things will go wrong. So we really do bet on founders that we'd like to bet on a proven track record. So in case the founder screws up, we do have, assets and revenue to work with. But that is the truth. And some founder, it's a hard game. This, you've built businesses. It is like a testament to your personal resilience to have succeeded in a business over the long term, because most people don't.
Yeah, absolutely. And, we are living in a time, 2020 has been the year of surprises for everybody, right? And the year of pivoting, the year of reinventing ourselves. It also has been the year where, consumption of alcohol addiction is up by 30%. There's a lot of collateral damages that have impacted many of us. How have you seen the space change, and how are people pivoting rapid enough? I would think that it would be a space that would be thriving, because as something like this takes place in the world, we look for comfort foods. We look for comfort outside of ourselves.
Yeah, well, it's a great point. I think there's two things that I want to make there. One is, I think COVID has accelerated the things that were already happening. So in cannabis, the companies that were already succeeding, well, they're on fire, right? And the companies that weren't doing very well, that happened more quickly. And so, you just saw this massive divergence between the two pathways. And so, the industry overall, sales are up 78% year over year. The industry is thriving. Wow. But what is also happening, is that, closings are up, bankruptcies are up across cannabis and across all industries. And so, the opportunity there is that, some of the businesses, when they were growing, they didn't pay attention to their bottom line. And, they didn't understand their individual SKUs and what the cost was to produce each individual product. And you get into a lot of trouble when you don't understand that, because then it's fine when everything's rocking and rolling and you got money coming in. But if sales slow down and you don't realize that you can't sell your way out of it, and that if you actually sell more of this product, oh crap, this product is actually a net loser for us. We couldn't tell because it was sort of baked into all of our other products. And so, we were selling more of this and we're losing more money. And that's not good in this market. And that happens a lot. So that's happening to some companies. That's where we swoop in and try to save the companies, buy them out at a massive discount, and then revitalize them. And then the good companies are really on fire right now. I mean, I would say, of our portfolio companies out there, there are probably, 10 or 12 that are having record sales. And that's out of, let's call it 20 companies in Fund 2. So 50% of the companies are at all-time highs across the portfolio. That's huge numbers. And I would say that there's another 30% of the companies that are having double-digit growth. And so the numbers are pretty fantastic. The only other point that I would make, though, is, I think you nailed it when you said that, we did search for comfort in these periods, and we have stress and alcohol and addictions up. But what I want to press upon people is, I think that's largely because, 1 in 3 Americans was let go from their job. And we need purpose as humans. If we don't have purpose, I mean, you know this too. I mean, we've both acquired some wealth, you know, and if you just stopped everything and did nothing, even though you had enough money, I imagine that you wouldn't feel as fulfilled, right? Like you don't do this program because you make a ton of money on it. You do it because you want to give back to people, and that fills your cup, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah, so I want to push more people to, that's why I talk about diversifying income streams and revenue streams all the time. Businesses, you can't have one revenue stream because of markets like this. And humans, you can't have one revenue stream because of markets like this. You have to diversify, not just for your bank account, but for your sanity.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, I didn't talk about your resume, but Codie, you're the managing director and partner at Entourage Effect Capital. You have the space raised over $170 million. You're in your third launch of $150 million. You know, prior to that, you were with First Trust managing over $150 million in Latin American investments. Prior to that, you were at Goldman Sachs, which is a $1.5 trillion company. Prior to that, you were with Vanguard in the international equity at Vanguard, $5.3 trillion. You're an incredible accomplished woman. You're graduated from help me, Georgetown University. And I love Georgetown. It's one of my favorite places in the world. How have you been able to accomplish all of this at your young age?
You're sweet. I think one of the things is that I'll say, you know, I really wasn't handed anything. I went to undergrad at Arizona State University. You know, my father didn't have a chance to go to college. I didn't even know I could apply out of state. You know, I got a scholarship to go locally. It's more of a party school than an academic one, to be sure. You know, I certainly had my nights there. And I think the only thing different is I have an equation I talk about it's called ECEC. And it's that when, you know, effort, curiosity, commitment, and execution meet, you can achieve pretty incredible things. So, you know, I'm always pushing people to think about that effort, curiosity, commitment, and then execution, which just means like you actually do the things that you learn about, right? You can achieve pretty incredible things. And I'll take a curious person over a detail-oriented person any day. And the research proves out that for successful people, and if we measure success by, let's say, you know, your business success, there's lots of other ways to measure it, but it's typically, do you have grit? Can you persevere? And are you curious and continuing to learn? And so those are the only things I think I have is I'm a bit of a masochist. I can take a lot of pain, and I'm super curious. And so I try to push people into that. And, you know, because I've been posting about it a lot, but I'm like I have this mission. I have a twofold mission. So every business I have, I put like a big, huge goal on it. So my Entourage Effect Capital cannabis business is we want to put $1 billion to work on this industry. And then we'd have a target return of 3 to 5x. So that means that we want to make, you know, $3 to $5 billion in cannabis. And we want to do that because that means that we fund $1 billion into this industry that I think would be one of the biggest industry changers from a decriminalization standpoint, from an economic impact, employment standpoint. So that's that goal. And then my other business, Unconventional Acquisitions, I want to create 100,000 small business owners. And so those two things push me every day because I really think that more people can do what you and I have done. And I certainly am not done yet. I have way more I need to do of owning businesses, of buying businesses, and of growing businesses than we were ever told we could. Nobody taught us this stuff. They taught us calculus.
Yeah, absolutely. And not only that, they didn't only just teach us calculus, they taught us things that were, that perhaps were not things that we needed to learn. Okay. The one of the things that I love, my son is at OSU and he is under their entrepreneurship degree, okay? Mm-hmm. Which, you know, entrepreneur for me was school of hard knocks, right? I mean, you try, you work hard, you fail, you succeed, you hire the right team, you keep trying and you keep, making it work. Today, there's actual opportunities for people to do that. And I'm very, very, very encouraged by that. I'm also encouraged by the fact that I think that this time with COVID has awakened a lot of us to search beyond ourselves, to look into personal development, to look into personal growth, to see what is not working in our belief systems, to see what is not working in our structure systems, in our government systems, to dismantle that and to create our own. And I think that's an incredible opportunity for this generation if we take the opportunity to move forward, if this is not just a moment in time, but a moment in action forever. And I think that's what needs to happen. Codie, you are a delight. I have a lot of love and respect for you. Where can people find you?
I think probably the easiest is Instagram. I'm at Codie Sanchez, C-O-D-I-E. And then I have a newsletter where I kind of discuss all these crazy ideas. That's contrarianthinking.substack.com. So either one of those.
And that will be available in the show notes. The incredible, kind, and beautiful Codie Sanchez. Thank you, thank you, thank you so much, Codie.
Thank you for having me. Truly a pleasure, Peter.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining us today on another episode of the Coming Clean podcast. Make sure to join Peter and his next guest on a brand new episode as we continue changing and impacting lives across the world. Share this episode with a friend, follow, subscribe, and leave a review.
Boy, I had to get it fast. Get a dash in my position, you would never last.